So here we are, date filtering, one of the most elusive topics when it comes to any type of software development or database management. Dates are hard. Dates are one of those things that make database management, software management, and everything in between so much harder. Now, for those of you who have written software, you know the pain that it is to work with dates. They're just hard to work with. But for those of you who are new to this space and new to SQL and new to databases, what makes working with dates so hard is the standard. The standard around dates has shifted as time has moved forward. And now in 2020, we're in a place where there are standards. There are ways to deal with databases and to deal with dates in databases and dates in software. There are standards in place that we can utilize. But I hear you asking yourself, okay, where did this all start? Well, dates are hard because of time zones, because we all live in a different place in the world. We all live in different times. We all live in various places across the globe, across the equator, and all of these places vary in time, day even sometimes. So, what is a time zone? Well, in 1884, Sir Sandford Fleming went to an international conference in the UK, in Greenwich. Now, you may have heard of Greenwich. It is known to be the central hub of time. Now, at this conference, he had the idea. He basically went there and he said, hey, everyone, let's try to align on the way we handle time. Now, how did he do that? Well, he basically proposed that we pick a point in the world and we offset every other country's time based on that central point. Now, that central point ended up being Greenwich in the UK. Now, why Greenwich? Well, it was a central hub of commerce in the world at the time. Everyone was trading with them. They were all over the place. They were a powerhouse. And so they got to be the center of time. Now, that's a big compliment to them. And of course, it was a monumentous moment in the world because we started uniformly measuring time. Never before in history were we so aligned. It was great. But there were still some issues. How do you draw the lines? Who is in what time zone? And there are all kinds of rules around this. And those rules dictate how time zones work. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, Mo, what does this have to do with databases? Well, I just told you that the UK, Greenwich, is the central hub of time. Now, that can mean two things. That can mean, one, every database should be set in GMT, or two, well, we have no standard, therefore everyone sets their database in their own time zone. Both things happened. Some people set their database in GMT to align to a universal standard, and others set it to their local time zone. On databases, this had a huge impact. How do you determine what your standard is? Now, GMT being the standard Greenwich Mean Time at the time, it wasn't really a standard. It was more an alignment. So, smart as we are, we decided to create a standard. And so we came up with UTC or CUT or UCT. All of these abbreviations mean the same thing. Universal Coordinate Time. It is a standard. It is a way to measure time. It is not a time zone. Let's be extremely clear. No country in the world is using UTC to determine its time. No country is using it as a time zone, so to speak. It is a standard. So what's the difference? Well, GMT is a time zone and UTC is a time standard. Now let's take a step back here because there's a whole lot of information there. So Sir Sandford Fleming in the 1800s decided we're going to align time across the world. Great. 100 years later, we start building databases and now we're in this predicament. We have to measure time. And at the time, okay, we weren't building the Facebooks of the world and the Instagrams of the world. No. We were building local apps for local hubs, and there wasn't really a problem with time zones or time standards or anything like that, really, because everything was local. We weren't really a global society online yet. We were getting there. We were moving forward. We were threading the needle on a lot of different issues, but we didn't really need a time standard just yet because software development was a new practice. But you can already start to feel the pain. Now, you're an engineer, you're an architect, and a client comes to you and they're like, hey, I need an app that crosses all boundaries of the world. Everyone should be able to use this. Now you have to make a decision. Okay, this app heavily relies on times and dates, and how am I going to work with this? Well, there is only one way. We have to use UTC. And since no territories use UTC, it is the standard that we can use. Now, why do you ask? Why can't we just use GMT? Aren't they the same? Well, they share the same current time. In essence, they are the same, but conceptually they are different. And why should we use that? Why can't I just use my local time zone and offset everything? Well, to be fair, you could. And if you set that as a standard and you store everything in that specific way, it should be fine. If everyone else knows that they have to offset it that way, and if incoming dates contain a time zone. For instance, let's just say I'm in Toronto right now, and someone's using my app in Australia. Well, if they send their date with the time zone information, I can easily put that into Toronto time and store it that way. And as long as I know that they live in Australia, I can reverse that back into their time zone. But that's a bit cumbersome, right? Sure, we know that our app is in Toronto time, but it doesn't really scale. Let's say we start having developers in other countries and we globalize like Facebook or Instagram. Well, standards are what drive everything. Standards are what make us align. And that's why UTC is a thing. We want to align. We want to all know the same thing. And as long as we know that we are storing things in UTC, there is sanity in the system. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, UTC and GMT share the same time. So why don't I just use GMT? Well, again, conceptually, they are different things. One is a time zone, the other is a time standard. We don't want our app to act as if it is in the UK. We want our app to act as if it's universal. Therefore, we use the standard UTC. Now, should we always use UTC? Over here, you see a command. And this command you can use to set your Postgres session, your current session, in UTC. And then you can start viewing dates and times as UTC. Now, before we get into that, I hear you having the question in your head. Okay, Mo, this is a lot. So we know GMT, we know UTC, we know a standard versus a time zone, and we know all of these things. Why do we need all of this? Again, keep in mind that when you're building software, we're a global society now, and many different users from many different regions will use your software. And so it is important to align to a standard that can allow software developers to offset dates and times in a sane way. You need to store them so that moving forward, they are all aligned. I don't want to store a date from a user in Australia with his Australian time zone and then have to offset that later on. That's a bit much. But I know the user lives in Australia, so why don't I just take his date, put it at a baseline, and whenever he requests it again, I just do the calculation. Everything is normalized. Everything is the same. That's the important part here. And when working with dates, it is important that we think about them in a uniform way. Always try to think about your data in a uniform way. Don't try storing data for different users in different ways. Always try to find the baseline. Always try to find a standard. We don't want to be storing the salary for one person in text and another person in number. We always want the same data type. And so when we think about dates and times, we want the same standard. We don't want to aligned to a person's country standard. We want our own standard. So over here, we're in Postgres, and you see the command show time zone. Now, if I execute this, what you'll see is that my time zone is set to America Toronto. Now, why is that? Well, when I installed Postgres, it aligned its configuration to my local configuration to show me dates and times in my local time zone. Now, does this mean that Postgres is storing dates and times in America Toronto time? Not at all. Not at all. Postgres is one of those database management softwares that has aligned their standard. They save everything already in UTC. They go even farther. They assume anything you give it that is both date and containing time is UTC. We have to do special operations in order to tell Postgres that this is of a different time zone. Now, we'll get into all of that. We'll look deeper into all of those edge case scenarios. But for now, the thing you really need to know is UTC is the standard that we want to follow. 99% of the time, it is the standard that makes the most sense. And when we install Postgres, Postgres is kind enough to align with our system time zone to show us dates and times that are visually and mentally aligned with the time zone we are in. But when it stores dates, when it stores times, anything that it takes into the system, it is going to assume that you are giving it a UTC format, a universal coordinate time format. So if I, for instance, wanted to fill in an hour that was 10 o'clock, if I did not specify that it had its own time zone, Postgres would automatically assume that the time you are giving it is already UTC. So Postgres is a database that stores everything in UTC time. And going off of that knowledge, we can now build our frame of reference around how time zones work. So let's go ahead and build that frame of reference. So over here, we see that time zone is set in America Toronto. And as I said, we can set the time zone to be UTC. Now, when we do this, we are not setting it to show us everything in UTC. No. We are setting our time zone only for this session. Let me show you. So right now it's America Toronto, and on the next run, it's UTC. Now let me close Valentina Studio, and let me reopen it. And what you'll see now is that when we do show time zone, oh, we're in America Toronto again. So when you set time zone, when you use that command, it is only for that session. If you want to change it at a system level to show you all dates and times in UTC at all times, you can do this, and you can do this in your PG config. Let's go look and see how to do that.